Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us here. Welcome to TWS's webinar series. My name is Kelly O'Connor. I'm the Wildlife Society's Conservation Policy Manager. In my role with TWS, I work to try and ensure that the science and expertise of our members is reflected in our society's policy engagement and advocacy work. I also help to develop the resources and opportunities to get our members a little more educated and engaged with wildlife and conservation policy, just like this webinar that y'all are here to participate in today. A couple just really brief sort of housekeeping bits at the top. If you would like to ask a question at any point during the webinar, please go ahead and use the Q&A feature. We're going to spend about 40 minutes on presentation, and then we should have time to get through questions at the end. So if anything comes up throughout the presentation and you want to ask a question, just go ahead and drop it in the Q&A. And we are recording the webinar today, so that recording is going to be available on the TWS website after the webinar concludes. Conservation policy and the wildlife professional. Today is going to be somewhat high level with the hopes that folks who have never engaged in policy, all the way to maybe those of you who have engaged, whether for your job or just personally, we can cover something new for everyone. We're going to spend the bulk of the webinar talking about the process of creating laws and regulations, and identify opportunities for wildlife professionals to actively engage with different phases of those processes, with considerations for how to make that engagement effective, and how what that looks like changes from sort of start to finish in policy development and implementation. And then we're going to spend some time talking about this idea of leveraging your professional expertise to influence conservation policy, with some considerations for specifically for members of our profession, and then finally highlight some resources that the Wildlife Society offers to support our members who are interested in policy engagement. And I wanted to take a second, kind of before we get into the process, to open with some thoughts on why we're here, why science and wildlife professionals are really integral to the development of conservation policy, as well as some of the challenges that we face today. So I think it's important, kind of right at the start, to establish this understanding that the Wildlife Society has a very unique voice within sort of the larger conservation advocacy sphere. Unlike some of our partners and contemporary organizations, we're not a wildlife advocacy organization, right? We are a professional association advocating for the work of our members, wildlife professionals. And so the work of our policy program is intended to tie into TWS's broader mission. We look for ways in which we can build a community of wildlife professionals around conservation policy, support those members as they look to engage in the policy arena, and make sure that both our society and our members are a trusted resource for policy and decision makers. This idea of, science as the backbone to meaningful conservation policy is foundational to the work of our policy program, right? So making sure that evidence-based insight is guiding both the development and the implementation of policies that impact both wildlife professionals and the resources that they manage. So just this idea or example of science-driven policy, thinking of an issue like wildlife crossings and wildlife vehicle collisions. So, taking the evidence of, annual mortality of wildlife on roadways, and looking at jeopardy to human health and safety, and sort of monetary damage resulting from wildlife vehicle collisions, right? Those are data points that have accrued over time, and in response, we have wildlife professionals working on wildlife crossing projects where we've got documented evidence of safe animal passages being used by wildlife and GPS tracking revealing exactly where animals, need to cross roadway structures. And then the responding policy, right? So in 2021, not that long ago, a congressional response to create something like the Wildlife Pilot Program and investing hundreds of millions of dollars over a relatively short time frame to require, data-driven projects to address this problem. So this nice example of, legislation driven by data with the goal of improving an issue that was identified by the scientific professional community. Wildlife policies, coming out of a body like Congress or a state legislature, those policymakers want to be able to say that they're proposing a bill that is grounded in good science, right? But those individuals often lack direct access to that information or maybe don't have the knowledge base that tells them how to go from data to policy solution. Hence the role of the wildlife professional in this scenario, right? So wildlife professionals become the bridge between empirical data and policy making and play this really crucial role in ensuring that policies are grounded in science, right? Ultimately to the benefit of ecosystems and communities. And that is certainly, our kind of mission within TWS's policy program is to continue to deliver this idea to decision makers that the expertise of wildlife professionals is really essential to all stages of the decision-making process. I think many folks will probably already be familiar with the idea that this is a challenging time for science-based conservation policy, right? So we are dealing with a tremendous amount of tension between kind of politics and scientific integrity and sort of combating policies that are being developed either without a scientific basis or to explicitly exclude science from decision-making processes. Many of the conservation programming that we rely on to collect the data that goes on to ideally inform these policies, those programs are facing really significant resource constraints, right? Limited funding, limited staffing, cuts to capacity, which limits our ability to, use that data to inform impactful policies. And then just this larger issue of misinformation and sort of dwindling public support for and perception of science and conservation professionals. So I think these points illustrate now more than ever this need for conservation professionals who are willing to lend their voice and their expertise to the process of developing and implementing policy so that this idea of a conservation professional has a face and a voice as opposed to just being sort of an abstract concept to folks in the larger policy space. So with that, moving on to kind of the how of these processes. And I wanted to start on the legislative end of things and this idea of how we go from problem or idea to a law. I'm going to be, at least for today, speaking largely at the US federal level, so talking about the actions of Congress in the United States. A lot of this still applies if you're interested in engaging with, say, a state legislature. TWS policy staff work largely at the US federal level. So, grounding some of these examples in congressional engagement. And I'm hoping we can take what can be quite a complex journey and kind of break that down into a series of steps with the hope that having at least sort of that baseline understanding of how a bill moves through Congress allows you to be able to more sort of comfortably and effectively engage across the various stages of that process. So very simply, right, starting with an idea or a problem, that idea will eventually spurn the drafting of a bill, which is introduced for consideration into Congress. It goes through several stages of review, amendment, debate. So starting from a congressional committee to the floor in either the House or Senate. It needs to pass both chambers of the House and Senate before it can be presented to the president for final enactment into law. And when that law is organized into US code, we would then typically refer to it as a statute. The reality of congressional policymaking is infinitely more complex than that and often nonlinear. So rather than sort of dig into the many iterations of that process, we're going to focus on what kind of engagement is best suited to each of these stages so that you can better understand kind of how to plug in, where to plug in, and how to effectively leverage your expertise. Right at the top, this first stage, right, this idea of an idea that requires some kind of legislative solution. Wildlife professionals are the best suited to bring those ideas forward to lawmakers, right? This is a critical role in helping a lawmaker who maybe has no expertise in wildlife science or wildlife management understand emerging threats to wildlife and ecosystems or opportunities to, better the management of natural resources. So you could look at an example like chronic wasting disease, right? And this idea that wildlife professionals on the ground are collecting data on population levels and disease prevalence and environmental impacts. All the while, chronic wasting disease may be a complete unknown to any given member of Congress. And so you then get the chance to assume this role of taking this problem, translating findings and data into clear and actionable insights for legislators. And so maybe that looks like approaching your member of Congress for support to establish funding for interstate CWD surveillance programs or proposing a new law for captive cervid facilities to prevent CWD spread. Wildlife professionals have the training and sort of existing knowledge base to develop educational resources, right? So maps to show how disease spread is impacting a member's state or district, charts to highlight economic consequences, and you even serve the role of kind of local storytelling, right? Making this issue sort of place-based and relatable to a legislator. So framing the science in terms of, real world outcomes and possible solutions. This is an excellent opportunity to shape policy and to also build relationships with your elected officials. And then, taking that idea into a draft bill. So we go from kind of more conceptual to more technical. And again, that technical knowledge comes from experts and professionals who are willing to look at the actual language of a bill that's being drafted and provide your expertise on, species biology, habitat requirements, making sure that if there are definitions included in draft legislation, that those have a biological basis and are, grounded in kind of best knowledge and best practice. This engagement with draft legislative text is something that TWS does as, part of our policy programming. We recently coordinated with our wildlife disease working group to provide feedback on a draft bill that would have established a wildlife disease surveillance program. And another great example of how we, lean on something like our working group for that expertise and engagement. But again, a really excellent opportunity kind of early in the process to make sure a bill is grounded in, the best available knowledge and sort of improve its chances of progressing through congressional review. Once a bill is introduced, now we have this really fantastic opportunity for education, right? So participating in something like a congressional briefing. So you can educate members of Congress at large as to how the bill, as it's written, would impact your work and in turn their constituents, and communicating sort of the work of wildlife scientists and managers more broadly. Typically, this is when Members of Congress are going to be preparing for things like legislative hearings or markups where they review a bill and propose amendments to its text. And so this is a great time to connect with, members of committees and really frame yourself as an expert and a resource to them as they prepare for deliberation and further engagement on the bill. A committee hearing is a great kind of benchmark to really provide your expertise to committee members in Congress, right? So providing something like written testimony to a committee in advance of a legislative hearing so that your expertise is on the record and available to those committee members as they're deciding if they want to advance this draft bill out of committee. We do occasionally get asked to connect a congressional committee with a TWS member who can serve as an expert witness on a legislative hearing panel. So that's something where if that's of interest, then we, as staff can support kind of preparation for that kind of engagement. But this is also a really fantastic time for more sort of behind the scenes engagement, right? So requesting meetings with members, with their staff, talking about ecological impacts, resource needs, making sure that they are aware that you are, there as a resource to be called upon as they prepare to engage with this bill more in depth. And I think a really great role for professionals at this stage is one of mobilizing, either broader support or broader awareness about a given bill. So working with your colleague networks, with partners, with other kind of stakeholder groups to distribute educational resources, to submit sort of joint letters, helping to weigh to lend more sort of credibility and scientific weight to constituency support behind the bill. Floor action on any given piece of legislation can be very fast. It can also be nonlinear, right? So bills can be returned to committee, they can be amended, they can stall. A lot of your engagement opportunity here is going to be as a constituent, communicating one-on-one with your members as they prepare to either vote to advance or not to advance a piece of legislation. So, reaching out directly with phone calls, with emails, communicating your expertise and kind of your credibility and making sure that their stance on a bill is well informed by sort of your, scientific expertise. This is, again, an excellent time for sort of mobilizing broader support, working across your kind of colleague networks to make sure that, if this is a bill that we want to pass, that folks are vocal in their support. And, similarly in opposition, if this is a vote that would have sort of measurable negative consequences on wildlife management, then making sure folks are aware and know how to contact their senators or their representatives and express their stance on a piece of legislation. At this stage, especially, timing, clarity are key, right? So well-prepared, kind of targeted input makes a really decisive difference in whether a bill is adopted or amended, or, like I said, stalls and sort of fizzles out. And then, once a bill is signed into law, certainly as a larger community, wildlife professionals are going to shift into the idea of implementation, right? So perhaps preparing more for the development of regulations, which we're going to touch on next, providing technical feedback, thinking of ways in which, this legislation is going to impact your work on the ground, and how to start preparing now to really document those impacts. I put on here this point of celebrating success. In any given session of Congress, many hundreds of draft bills are introduced that will never pass into law, right? And only a fraction of those have any relevance for wildlife conservation and management, and a fraction of those will be passed into law, right? And I think that there is something important if a bill passes into law that as a community we have consensus, this is science-based, this is going to implement meaningful, beneficial conservation policy. Um, Being vocal in celebrating that as a community, telling lawmakers that you appreciate the work that they've done on this bill, sharing with the public that, this is a success. That goes a long way, I think, in building this understanding of how, science-based policies impact wildlife management to the benefit of communities and ecosystems more broadly. This idea of how to speak to an elected official or communicate your positions to an elected official is kind of a workshop or a training in and of itself. Um, and so this is an incredibly condensed version of some of our policy communications resources that I hope folks will be interested in visiting more in depth in the future. But the way that you communicate with a congressional office or, your elected officials really dramatically shapes how that input is received. And just to emphasize that, a staff member of a member of Congress every day is juggling dozens of issues within kind of their larger portfolio. They're receiving tens, hundreds of phone calls, emails from constituents in their members' district or state. And so establishing your relevance and your credibility really matter. I put up here this example of a hypothetical bill that would um, modify funding available for wildlife habitat restoration on public lands, right? And an A versus a B. So certainly members of Congress will receive, phone calls on a bill saying, "Hello, my name is so and so. I don't like this bill. You should vote no. Thank you for your time. Goodbye." Um, in a perhaps more clear and passionate manner, but all the same, this isn't something that is super actionable for an office, right? It's vague. It's not referencing a specific bill or a specific action being requested. Other than introducing yourself as a biologist, there's no scientific context. There's no sort of expertise embedded here. It's sort of just opinion. And there's no connection to that member's district or state, their role on a committee, their priorities. So it is unlikely to shape influence in terms of a policy outcome versus this option B, which is something like if you as a member reached out to TWS and said, "I want to write a letter to my member of Congress on this bill. Can you help me do so in a way that is effective?" This is something that we might work with you to craft, right? So it names the bill, the specific section. It's grounded in data, firsthand scientific experience. It opens with credentials, it highlights local relevance, and offers this individual up for follow-up, right? So if a staff person really wants to do their research, they can reach back out to you. And I think most importantly, it's respectful, it's concise, and it's nonpartisan. So all of this to say, that format of communication is a skill that requires practice. We do some more kind of targeted workshops and trainings where we go from, a peer-reviewed article to a letter to a member of Congress and things like that. So you don't necessarily need to, right now, as you're viewing this webinar, have the ability to, craft a communication like that. But we do, as TWS, have ways to support you if you're looking to do more of this and like this kind of interaction with your decision makers and your elected officials. So, sort of the other side of the coin, going from legislative to regulatory. So, a law, a statute sets a broad framework for goals, authorities, requirements. But as wildlife professionals and practitioners, you need implementation details, right? And things like procedure, timeline, scientific criteria, those are rarely included in law. They are left to regulation. So a regulation is a legally binding rule created by a federal agency to carry out a statute. Perhaps some of you are state or federal employees and are tasked with this process of developing regulations. At the federal level, the rulemaking process occurs under the Administrative Procedure Act, or the APA. And that sets the kind of ground rules for the creation, revision, and enforcement of regulations. And the big idea in this process is transparency and accountability, right? Making sure that our agencies are developing regulations in a way that is publicly accessible and transparent, and especially for regulations relevant to wildlife conservation and science, making sure that scientific information and expert input is incorporated and has a chance to shape the final outcome of a rule. So similar to our very simplified view of the legislative process, here's kind of broad strokes on the regulatory side of things. We similarly have to have sort of an identified need for a rule by an agency. That could be because Congress has passed a new law. That could be a court requiring clarification, new science emerging on an issue, or kind of changed conditions on the ground. In this scoping or pre-rule stage, this is where agencies are gathering information, are consulting with their experts internally as well as experts externally, and outlining possible approaches to the rule. Once that rule has been drafted and is published, the agency publishes a proposed rule in the Federal Register. This is essentially they're saying, here's our plan, here's why we think it meets the requirements set out in statute, and here is the science and analysis behind it. That stage includes a public comment period, typically somewhere between 30 and 90 days, where you as wildlife professionals have the strongest opportunity for engagement, which we'll get into in a couple slides here. The Administrative Procedures Act requires agencies to consider and respond to all substantive comments that they receive during this stage of public comment review and any rule revision that they deem prudent. And then after reviewing comments, making revisions, the agency will publish its final rule. And that's going to include responses to major issues raised by commenters during that public comment period. Once it's published, it becomes typically legally binding within a set time frame within the scope that has been authorized by Congress. And then similar to legislation, the process turns more to implementation and monitoring of that rule. So this idea of scoping and information gathering and how you can kind of plug into this pre-rule stage. There are often formal announcements of scoping or preparation to prepare a rule. So you might see something like an advance notice of proposed rulemaking or a notice of intent. Oftentimes that is also accompanied by a public comment opportunity or specific questions from the agency, basically outlining the kind of data and information that they are looking for to guide their drafting of the rule. So that is a great way to kind of frame your engagement if this is a rule that falls within kind of your subject area of expertise. And there are often kind of broader, more informal means of engagement, doing something like participating in a listening or Q&A session where you can speak to agency members who are developing this rule. And then you may also be involved in something like an advanced stakeholder meeting if you're a state or tribal employee or a member of another sort of identified interest group. The actual drafting of regulatory text is largely an internal process, although groups like professional societies may be consulted, as well as, like I said, sort of external technical experts during this time. But really, if you are interested and aware that this rulemaking is sort of forthcoming, this is an excellent time to start kind of gathering your data, your resources, field knowledge, anything that you are likely to input during the next phase of the process, which is the public comment period. So I mentioned the Federal Register. That's where federal agencies will post all of their notices of proposed rulemaking, as well as draft rule text, scientific justification, any data that informed relevant analyses, and instructions for public comments. And this is the time to provide evidence-based insight, right? So field data, any management experience, any case studies or peer-reviewed literature. The idea is to make sure that the agencies have all of the information and the best information available to sort of shape the final rule, whatever that may look like. In addition to submitting sort of individual comments, this is when I'll often encourage folks to work with their broader network. So if you're a member of a TWS chapter or section, for example, looking for folks in your organization unit who are also interested in this rulemaking and can submit comments to kind of amplify your impact during this process. And there are typically more opportunities for kind of conversational engagement here. So if you are interested in attending a webinar, that's usually an opportunity to actually ask questions of agency staff who are developing this rule or participating in something like a public hearing. But I want to kind of break up this sequence here and for a little bit focus on this idea of substantive comments during an opportunity for public comment. I think, this stage in the regulatory process is the most important point in which, you as a wildlife professional can insert your expertise. But to do so effectively, it's important to understand what agencies mean by a substantive comment, right? So this is a term under the Administrative Procedure Act, and it's really central to how a public comment may eventually influence a rule. So in a made up-ish scenario where the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is proposing regulations to adjust how they designate critical habitat for a listed species, they publish some proposed rule text, the scientific basis they relied on, the data available, and their rationale for the proposed approach. And now we have 30 days to review and provide substantive comment. During that comment period, the service will almost certainly receive thousands of comments, but not all of those comments will share the same weight, right? So many thousands of comments will probably look like option A here. I oppose this rule. I think it's bad for wildlife. Please do not adopt it. This is a comment, expressing a viewpoint, but it does not provide the agency with anything actionable. There's no data. It's not speaking to errors in decision making or criteria that the agency used to develop its proposal. Under the Administrative Procedures Act, agencies are not required to directly respond to this type of comment because it is not substantive in nature, as opposed to option B here. So, a substantive comment that makes sure to identify specific elements of rulemaking proposal, cite relevant scientific information, and explain, in your expert opinion, potential consequences if the rule was to move forward without modification. So within, APA, agencies must address substantive comments. They may not change the final rule in the way that you request or recommend, but they do show in the final rulemaking that they reviewed your comment, your evidence, that they evaluated it and explained their reasoning for their response. So this again is another kind of exercise that we offer more sort of focused training on. But just to emphasize, I think wildlife professionals are well suited to um, this kind of communication, right? This is not so far off from technical communications that you may already be used to. It's just making sure that you are really effective in how you are communicating this information so that an agency can actually use it. And ideally, that final rule is influenced by the information that you're providing. So, following sort of the closure of public comment, agencies are going to be reviewing, categorizing all of the comments they received, and revising the rule accordingly, depending on sort of the nature of those comments. And again, those substantive comments supported by science or particularly implementation experience are going to carry the most weight during this process. If you provided a substantive comment, it's possible that you'll receive some kind of outreach asking for additional information or follow-up. But really, in terms of engagement, this is a time to kind of continue discourse among your colleague networks in terms of sort of next steps, right? What's implementation going to look like if the rule passes as written, or if changes are made in the manner that you've suggested. The agency publishes the final regulatory text, like I said, in the Federal Register, including that detailed response to comments and the rationale for their final decisions. And then the rule takes effect after a defined period, typically, unless it is delayed by things like litigation or actions by Congress. And this is a great time, if you're working sort of in a sphere that is going to be impacted by this rule, starting to provide feedback to agencies, to regulators as to sort of what you envision from implementation, because they are going to be turning to preparing relevant guidance documents, right? And still want that sort of open input on how this rule is going to be implemented on the ground. And then in this stage of implementation and monitoring, again, making sure that you are kind of tracking and communicating the on the ground impacts of these regulations. I mentioned one sort of driver for a new rule or a rule revision is an understanding that conditions on the ground have changed and that rule needs to be modified accordingly, right? And so wildlife professionals are kind of the eyes on the ground that can signal maybe this rule does need to be modified a bit to address the conditions that we're seeing in practice. Um, the only other thing to kind of flag here is if this kind of opportunity is ever of interest to you, we do, as TWS, look to find members with the relevant expertise to serve on advisory committees, so federal advisory committees, and support kind of the longer term implementation and monitoring of relevant rulemaking. So that's a way that wildlife professionals can, again, really harness that expertise towards the implementation of a rule. So finally, moving on from kind of specific process, I wanted to spend a little bit of time at the end of our webinar here with some of these considerations for engagement specific to wildlife professionals. And this is grounded in kind of my professional interactions with our members and some of the questions that I get from members looking to become more engaged and looking for support or resources from the Wildlife Society to do so. And I think by far the idea of ethical and responsible policy engagement as a wildlife professional is probably the most common theme that I encounter when I discuss policy engagement with TWS members. TWS wants our members to be able to contribute their expertise to shape policy and decision making, right? But as wildlife professionals, your credibility is truly your greatest asset. And when we engage with decision makers, we hear time and time again how valued the professionalism of our members is, your scientific expertise and your integrity. At the same time, we also recognize that many of our members hold positions within government agencies, within academic institutions, or other organizations that have their own rules around advocacy and representation. And so just to emphasize this understanding that there are real considerations around sort of professional ethics. Um, Things like, clearly distinguishing your personal participation in policy engagement versus engaging in a professional capacity, navigating things like conflict of interest or misrepresentation of employer policy. This is not an sort of an easy area. There is a lot of kind of grayness, and just to flag that it's something that policy staff have the utmost respect for our members' credibility and are happy to provide guidance and kind of individual considerations for our members if you want to engage more, but you have some of these concerns around navigating these boundaries. Um, we have a really extensive library of policy resources developed by our staff, but targeted specifically at wildlife professionals and our members to try and make your engagement, well-informed, effective, and ultimately not burdensome, right? Easy. So all the way from things like our position and issue statements, if you're looking to kind of scope engagement on an issue and you want to know, is this something TWS has already weighed in on? What are the positions of my society on something that you're considering engaging with? We have a library of technical reviews. So if you're looking for the best available science in sort of one location relating to a specific policy issue, technical reviews give you that sort of in-depth analysis of information. If you want to engage with an elected official and you're looking for handouts that you can leave with an office, we've got a library of fact sheets and policy briefs that are targeting sort of key issues and key pieces of legislation and make great kind of educational resources or templates to create your own educational resources. And then we have dating back at least, I want to say 15, maybe 20 years, a library of all of TWS's policy correspondence, as well as letters, comments, testimony, position statements developed by TWS chapters and sections. We have a policy toolkit, which is our most kind of member engagement focused policy resource. This covers everything from how to organize a group of policy interested members to how do you participate in a Zoom call with a congressional staffer, or how do you, write comments during public comment on proposed rulemaking. And then more kind of staff-driven resources, right? Things like policy news, if you follow our news content on wildlife.org, targeted training and workshop opportunities if you're a chapter or section member looking to offer, policy-focused training to your membership. Staff like myself are here to consult on individual issues if you're looking to help shape sort of a strategic plan for engagement. And then if you want to become better connected with, say, your members of Congress, we're also here to help facilitate that outreach to congressional offices. So all of that to say, you are not alone, and we have sort of a wealth of resources that hopefully can help you kind of get your foot in the door when starting on this path of more effective policy engagement. I wanted to flag briefly our Conservation Affairs Network. If you are a chapter or a section member looking to become more engaged, this is our kind of communications framework across all of our chapters and sections focused around policy engagement opportunities. So if you are interested, we produce a monthly Conservation Affairs Network newsletter highlighting TWS's policy work as well as the policy engagement of all of our chapters and sections. If you're interested in providing input to TWS to shape our policy engagement, we put out those calls for feedback and engagement in that newsletter. And then conservation affairs committees, so groups of policy-minded individuals in chapters and sections are always in need of interested and engaged members. So if that sounds like you and you're not already plugged in with your chapter or section conservation affairs committee, go subscribe to the CAN newsletter and reach out to your CAC and learn a little bit more about how you can get involved. So before we have 10-ish minutes or so for questions, just some sort of key takeaways, right? This idea of science and wildlife professionals at the core of meaningful wildlife policy, and the fact that if you're here today and you're interested, you are the best position to kind of lend your expertise in this policy arena. There are multiple opportunities throughout both the legislative and regulatory process of policy development to engage, and that can very much be targeted to your expertise and kind of your level of comfort with engagement. Focusing sort of, regardless of where in those processes you're going to engage on clear and effective communications to policymakers, that's going to help give your science and your expertise lasting impact. And then now is a great time to start practicing. If you don't know who your members of Congress are, start there. Or like I said, subscribe to the CAN newsletter, start following policy news on wildlife.org. The Wildlife Society is here to help and support you. But we need more wildlife professionals, like I kind of opened with an interest in this subject area. So thank you so much if you joined and you stuck around for the whole webinar here. I think I have about 10 minutes for questions. I'm going to do my best to navigate chat and all of this good stuff. And I have a couple other questions popping in as well. So let me get, and actually, I don't know, Trisha, maybe I will ask you to help me navigate the chat, just so I can make sure I'm getting to everyone.
No problem. I'm happy to do that. In fact, I can even start with the question I asked you in the chat,
Yeah.
which is related to establishing your credibility as a scientist or a biologist, identifying who you work for, but not implicating who you work for, and kind of what's acceptable and what's not.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the is it okay to name your employer is gonna vary by employer, and are you interacting, with a legislator in your professional capacity? Certainly some folks like in their professional scope for like state wildlife agencies are charged with interacting with legislators, right? And so then your professional credentials are kind of just built into that engagement. Otherwise, like I said, it's going to depend on are you there in a personal capacity or professional capacity? If it's personal, I tend to, well, Cameron, you came off mute. Do you want do you want to add something?
Hey everybody, Cameron Kovac. I'm Chief Program Officer engaged in policy efforts. There are many layers of ethics laws associated with this, but I'm going to refer to kind of the most famous one, and that's the Hatch Act, which prohibits a federal employee from lobbying in their professional capacity. And so if you are lobbying in your personal capacity, you can disclose who your employer is, but you have to clearly articulate that you are there not in a professional capacity. You're only there within your personal capacity. So, for example, I work for the Department of Interior, but I am not here in an official capacity. I'm here to discuss issues of personal importance.
Yeah, and I'll flag that we have a TWS brief on Hatch Act considerations if you're a federal employee interested in policy engagement that Trisha, maybe I'll share that link with you to send around to folks after the fact. Yeah, so kind of, erring on the side of just being very aware of those sort of rules within your professional standing. And I'll say also that question or some version of that question comes up often enough. I've been working on developing some new toolkit guidance on this kind of larger scope of, ethical policy engagement that we'll hopefully have to share more broadly in the near future here.
Great, thanks. I think, yeah, it's always a difficult bridge to walk is how to do that. Another question came in from Amanda, and she asked, when you introduce a bill, do you have to have a financial path laid out for how the funding will be collected or distributed, or is that worked out in committee review?
sometimes that's not even worked out after committee review, right? So having dedicated funding sort of established and committed, I would say would certainly increase your likelihood of success for that bill. But there's plenty of legislation that's introduced without a known, identified and committed funding mechanism.
Yeah, I would agree with that. There's difference too in like, does the bill authorize funds or is it make those funds mandatory? If it's mandatory, that does require a pay-go or offsets, and that's not even necessarily needed when the bill is introduced. If it does go to the floor, if it does start moving, then appropriations committees will look at that. And if the bill is funding authorized up to a certain amount, then there may not be an offset in that anyway. That'll just be the funding will be authorized through annual appropriations at that point, and any caps that are put on Congress in the total amount of appropriated funds.
Thanks. Another question, there's a couple questions related to like just the political landscape and polarity and how to address your legislators related to, maybe you on lots of things you're on the different side of the aisle, but on this you want to talk to them. Any suggestions around that? And again, also, the science piece of sharing the information,
Yeah. Sorry, Cameron, did you have something?
I mean, I always have something. I mean, just when I think about, we are all essentially biased by our life choices, by our career pathways, by what we choose to engage in, and the role that I view for wildlife professionals, in particular, like from like a professional capacity, is to really make sure that your advocacy is done in an informed manner. And so I like to lean into my passions and my interests, and I want to make sure that they're supported by the science that is being done. And there's also a dividing line that I see in like the Wildlife Society, in that we are not just advocates for wildlife, but we're advocates for wildlife professionals. And so while many factors need to be weighed in, everyone from those differing perspectives and values are bringing their own personal biases in. And it's the job of Congress to take all of the information that is available to them and help find that path forward. And if we are not being strong advocates for wildlife funding or for things that are tools that we need as wildlife professionals to conserve wildlife, then we are not being effective at our jobs.
Yeah, very, very well said. I guess I would just share from kind of professional experience as well. Once, if and when you get to the point of building relationships with congressional staff members and actually having these discussions with those individuals, um, the you can become more removed from the politics, right? I mean, those staff, particularly if they have an interest in science legislation and wildlife legislation, are very much appreciative of your expertise, and those are I think really fulfilling conversations to have. It's not, regardless of kind of political party. In my experience in having those conversations with staff, you can have meaningful progress made in conversation, even if you're, touching on a potentially politically polarizing topic.
I've always been able to find an area of common interest or passion with representatives that I've spoken with, and that's often a good icebreaker, because you may have disagreement on your points of view, but when you find those commonalities and are able to connect on that, it makes those representatives and those staffers that much more willing to listen to what you have to say in the future.
Yeah, I mean, wildlife is cool, right? And like the work of wildlife professionals for many of our elected officials, if they get a chance to see what you do, that leaves a very lasting impression that I think sort of transcends um, kind of the politics of the time. And there, I think, is a lot of power in that value component, right? And those shared values around something like wildlife that we use along with, the scientific basis for our work.
There was also a question about, does TWS publish a code of ethics? And I will add a link to the TWS code of ethics, but I also wanted to know, Cameron or Kelly, if you had a comment on that code of ethics.
No, I mean, the code of ethics extends to all members, and our code of ethics goes to kind of how members engage with others in executing their work as a wildlife professional. And so, yeah, I encourage everybody to read those. It's something that all members agree to adhere to when they join TWS.
I
There's
wanted,
some, oh, go
oh,
ahead,
Trisha, go
Kelly.
ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say there's a couple of questions about getting your slides and
Yeah.
about a recording of this webinar, and the recording will be put on the TWS website under events in the coming probably week or so, and that's available to anyone. And then I will work with Kelly to answer additional questions, either individually or to the group. But there are a number of answers already in the Q&A with links to how to sign up for the Conservation Affairs Network and other TWS resources.
Yes, yeah. Thank you to, I think it was Lisa who posted the CAN newsletter link and some other kind of responses to questions in the chat. Lisa is a Conservation Affairs Network leader, and we appreciate her participation and expertise. I'm just kind of scanning quickly, Trisha, anything else we want to make sure to get to? Otherwise, like Trisha said, we're going to make sure that any questions that we didn't have time for today, that we'll get some responses and some additional materials and send things around to all of our participants after the fact.
The only other thing I was seeing is related to having kind of more local policy trainings or webinars, if that's something TWS can do. And also there was a question about communications and delivery training. And I am pretty sure at the annual conference, there's usually at least one workshop annually that talks about communications and or communications and policy. So that's one place to get that. But I did see a question, I think it came from Andy, about if there was an opportunity to get someone to do the presentations like this for more region or a chapter.
Yeah, great plug for our workshops at the annual conference. We'll typically host a policy focused workshop as well as a science communications focused workshop, which are both great opportunities. As for kind of like local like chapter speaking engagements and stuff like that, please reach out to me directly. I'm always really happy to participate whenever I can in delivering, if it's not this webinar, then something more targeted to issues or topics of interest. And then a plug back to our policy resources if you are looking for kind of print education materials, take a look at what's in our library. There's a lot of great, like I mentioned, fact sheets, policy briefs, and other materials that you can kind of pull from.
I'll just add, send us a note too. If there's something that you're not seeing
Yeah.
that you think TWS could provide, please let us know. We are in particular working with American Fisheries Society and the Ecological Society of America on trying to expand our professional development materials and trainings. And so knowing what gaps that our members are collectively seeing will help inform where we put the time in to investing in those materials.
Great. Thank you, Kelly and Cameron, for putting on this webinar. I think it was really informative and and that will be helpful to a lot of us.
Yeah, thank you so much to everyone for joining. Hoping we can kind of continue and offer more policy-focused webinars in the future, but appreciate your participation and some of these great questions. And like I said, please, if you do have kind of policy programming, outreach needs, questions, anything like that, reach out at any time.